this is the first time you've joined us for one of these series on identifying the commoner species of Britain. And if this goes well, I might well be persuaded to do a duck one next. So if there are people out there interested in identifying ducks, we might well have another one going in the new year on that. So let me start by saying a few words about myself, and then we've got a yes please on the ducks. Great. I will record that as something we'll need to look at in the new year then. But a little bit about myself. So my day job, I'm the head of conservation for the environment charity A Rocha UK. And in my spare time work as local chair of the Wildlife Trust, Hampshire Wildlife Trust, as well as the Conservation Officer for Hampshire Ornithological Society. So have my work cut out for me. I'm also married to a South African, and we have 4 boys at home. So that keeps me pretty busy. We've missed our summer and winter holidays this year, like many of you. So we're just hoping that next year proves to be a little bit better. But if you want to join me for a bird ID and retreat in Northern Ireland next summer, I'll be running a retreat on bird identification with a charity next July. If you want to find out more, do be in touch. So a little bit about gulls before I start the talk, and it's always good to say that you're in good company if you really struggle to identify British gulls. One of my first experiences as a teenager was at Staines Reservoir in West London, where I found what I thought was a ring-billed gull. Now, for those of you who know what a ring-billed gull is, you'll know it's quite hard to identify. For those of you who've got no idea what it is, it's an American gull that turns up in small numbers every year in the UK. Anyway, I found a gull with a black ring around its beak. And at that time, there was a thing called Birdline run by a gentleman called Richard Millington. And I put out this story that there was a ring-billed gull at Staines Reservoir. And within 2 hours, over 100 people had descended on Staines Reservoir's main causeway, only to find that it wasn't a ring-billed gull. It was a common gull, which, as many of you will know, is not nearly quite so exciting. And my reputation as a teenage bird watcher was in tatters because I had misidentified a rare gull. And so my starting point with the story with gulls is that they are very hard sometimes to identify. They're great fun identifying them, but the rule of thumb is if it looks like a common black-headed herring or black-backed gull, it probably is one. The likelihood of it being something really rare is quite small. So most rare gulls turn out to be something much commoner. So that's my story of how I got into gulls. But to finish with a little funny story before we go into the slide presentation, one of the gentlemen who is on this call, I can see him on the Zoom, but I will not mention their name, was sea watching off Pennington Marshes a few years ago. And he found in his telescope a Mediterranean gull flying past, which at the time, a few years ago, was quite a rare bird. And so he announced to the assembled crowd of 20 people that he had just found a Mediterranean gull, to which one well-known sea watcher said, "How do you know that that's what it is? Because you're looking a long way out." He said, "Well, it's got a big, whopping, great orange beak." As it came closer, he came to realize that not only was it not a Mediterranean gull, but it wasn't a bird at all. It was a Sainsbury's carrier bag. And the orange beak turned into the orange handle. So my suggestion to all of you is it's better to assume everything is common before calling out it as a rare bird, because you never know. It might not only not be a gull, it might be a plastic bag. Anyway, that's my story to start the talk off with. The plan this evening, I'm going to keep the talk relatively short because I know if you're like me, Zoom concentration times are rather more limited than in person. But there will be a chance at the end for the questions that you have asked and put to me to be answered. And Barry will be fielding those questions towards the end of the talk. Barry, if you can unmute yourself just to make sure that as I share the screen, everything technology-wise is working properly.
Sure.
I'm just going to go in from the beginning. Barry, just to check that everyone can see that screen.
All good,
Right.
Andy. You're good to go.
Thanks very much. So a very warm welcome to an introduction to the commoner gulls of the UK. If during this talk you find that I leave you behind and you're wanting to ask questions that you may not have fielded at the beginning to the team, then by all means put a few questions in the chat and Barry can pick those up due course, and we will get through as many questions as we can in the time allotted, but we'll give priority to those who've asked the questions already, because that's only fair to those who have put in questions. So we're going to take a tour through the gulls of Britain and focusing on the commoner species. Perhaps the most familiar species of all is our wonderful black-headed gull. It is by far the commonest species in the UK, and if you go to nature reserves like Titchfield Haven in summer, it's probably the commonest breeding bird of all. I always think black-headed gull is a rather ironic name, because actually, as that picture sort of shows, its head is chocolate brown rather than black-headed. So it got its name as a black-headed gull, but it is less black-headed than two of our other species, which we will come across in due course. But let's have a look. This is a breeding plumage black-headed gull, and as some of you may be able to see, it's got this lovely white crescent behind the eye, which is very distinctive. It's a little white crescent that's shared by that and the rarer Mediterranean gull. You'll also notice that during the breeding season, the beak goes very, very dark blood red. So familiar features with black-headed gull in summer is this dark chocolate brown hood, but you'll notice it doesn't go all the way to the back of the head. So the back of the head remains white, and the legs are also this lovely dark red color. And you'll notice as well that it's got a black wingtips, but a white tail. So in flight, as you'll see in a second, it shows a white tail in adult summer plumage, but black wingtips with very, very small little white mirrors when compared to some of the larger gulls. And it's this lovely silvery grey back. If black-headed gull was rarer, it would be one of those species that you'd flock to see. But as it's a very common species, it's often ignored and overlooked. Now, when you get into winter time, the plumage changes significantly. This is an adult winter plumage black-headed gull, and you'll notice that behind its eye, it's got this little black smudge. It's what's left of its black head from the summer. And during the course of the winter months, its black smudge grows and grows and grows until it returns to its black-headed appearance in early spring. And climate change is having a real impact on black-headed gulls, because many of you will notice that the blackheads are coming back earlier. Now, how much earlier, still to be debated. But a lot of science reports indicate that the blackhead returns to the black-headed gull about 3 weeks earlier than it used to back in the 1960s. So how can you tell a black-headed gull in winter? Well, apart from the little black smudge behind the eye, you'll notice it's got this lovely pale red beak. The beak turns lighter red in winter with a tiny little black tip and these kind of orange red legs. So the leg color and the beak color changes. Also, the wing pattern changes a little bit. So the wingtips are slightly less black in winter than in summer on a lot of birds, but I also mentioned the white tail. If you look at its tail, you'll see there's no black markings in the tail. Now, you'll probably be thinking to yourself, are we going to go on to juvenile gulls in this talk? The answer is not in any great detail, because when you're dealing with juveniles and first and second winters, that's the first year and second year birds, the plumages get much more complicated. And if there's a real appetite out there for learning about juvenile first winter, second winter, first summer, second summer gulls, maybe that's a talk for next year. So let's see how it goes. But if any of you out there think I'd really like a more advanced talk on gull identification when they're in their really difficult plumages, then that's maybe something that we could look at doing. So there you go. There we have the different plumages of gulls alongside each other. We've got the adult summer in breeding plumage on the left, where you can see much more black under the wing, very, very contrasty white and black. This chocolate brown hood with the white eye ring and the very dark bill and legs. And then in winter, you've still got a certain amount of contrast under the wing, not quite as much, but you've got that paler beak and the paler legs and that black smudge. So all quite distinctive features. So that's our black-headed gull. Let's move on to a second species, which is a familiar species for many of us, but its name is not accurate. So just as a black-headed gull doesn't have a black head, so a common gull is actually not at all common. As a breeding species, it's got a much lower breeding population nationwide than black-headed gull. They're much more sedentary. You don't generally see them in the large flocks, and numbers in many parts of the country are in decline. Now, perhaps the most familiar place to see a common gull is on farmland and in winter. You're much more likely to encounter common gull during the winter months than you are in the summer months. And so here we have a typical adult common gull. This is a winter plumage bird, and the only way you can really tell the difference between winter and summer is on bill color. But if you have a look at the bill, it's a yellow bill, and in this plumage you can see a little tiny black ring towards the tip of the beak and then a little red dot. In the summer, the dot and the ring are often less apparent and the bill looks a lot yellower and the legs look a lot yellower too, but they are generally a yellow-billed, yellowish legged bird. And compared to black-headed gull, you'll notice that the back is a darker shade of grey. In some plumages, common gull can appear very dark, and actually for those of you who are less familiar with gulls, some people say, "Oh, is that a black-backed gull, a lesser black-backed gull?" The answer is no. Common gull is a much smaller gull than either lesser or greater blackback. They look daintier. If you look at the eye, it's got what's known as a gentle eye. It's a dark eye, it looks quite soft, it's got quite a small hunched neck, so the neck appears quite short. It's moderately short-legged and quite short-winged. Again, with those little white mirrors you can see on an otherwise black wing, with also a dark tail tip, which you'll see in a little bit. So that's common gull. And here's an adult summer plumage common gull in flight. So in summer, they often lose that black ring and the red tip. They've got these lovely jet black wings with the white primaries, so little white tips to the prime, little white mirrors you can see towards the ends of the wings, and then a very, very snow white underwing and a white tail. They're a lovely gull to look at. And actually, if you were around in the 60s and 70s, common gull were much commoner. And as farming intensified, common gull numbers, particularly during wintertime, really declined. So it's not unusual to go a winter and not see common gull if you're not a keen bird watcher. They're an easy bird to miss. Now here's common gull in a whole range of different plumages, because they are a tricky little bird. And we're not going to go through all the plumages, but a couple of features to look out for. And the first is, in the younger birds, it's worth looking out for the jet black tail band. So if you look up at the top bird, which looks like it's got something in its mouth, you'll see it's got a black tail tip apparent in all the younger plumages, really dominant, really stands out. We mentioned the dark bill, little tip just before the tip of the bill, a little black mark in winter. And the other feature you'll notice on some birds, if you look at the bottom of the picture, there's a winter adult, and you'll see some dusky streaking on the back of the head. So if you're thinking, how do I tell that apart from a black-headed gull in winter? Remember, the black-headed gull has the black smudge behind the eye and a red beak with a black tip. And the common gull has this streaking behind the eye and a yellow beak. Now, I'm going to really confuse everybody, because having just looked at a largely white-headed gull with a yellow beak, we're now going to look at another white-headed gull with a yellow beak. And perhaps the hardest two common species to tell apart from each other are common gull and kittiwake. The really good news is that kittiwake and common gull don't tend to occur unless it's at sea in similar locations. So kittiwake, as many of you will know, are a cliff breeding species, and it gets its name from its call, which is kittiwake. And so if you've ever been to a place like Bempton Cliffs in the northeast, or St Bees Head in Cumbria, you'll have been overwhelmed by the sounds of kittiwakes breeding, and they tend to nest on very, very small ledges indeed. They are smaller than the common gull. They're a really dainty looking, attractive bird. And they've also got different colours on them. So although they've got this long, slender yellow beak, which is longer and thinner than on common gull, it's also, you can't see in that picture, but often very dark and much darker legged. The white extends further down the back, and you'll notice that there's a lack of mirrors, little white patches in the tail tips there and the wing tips. So on the wing tips, the mirrors are missing, and you can see the young bird in that picture. So common gull will often show little white mirrors in the wing tips. Kittiwakes very rarely show any at all. Now, here we've got two pictures. We've got here juvenile kittiwakes, and you'll see that unlike a black-headed gull, which has a black smudge behind the eye, in young kittiwake it forms a black band. So it's a distinctive black band that goes all the way up from the ear, all the way across the top of the head. Sometimes more obvious than others. So if you look at the bird that's sitting on the cliff, the bird that's furthest up in the image, there's a youngster with a really clear back banding. Young birds often show small, dark beaks rather than yellow beaks, and very dark legs, black tail tips, and this very contrasting black forewing with a white hindwing. So really spectacular looking bird as a youngster. And young birds you often encounter at sea. You'll see them flying past. If you get that flash of black and white and combined with a small black beak and an obvious black smudge to the rear of the head, you're looking at a young kittiwake. The flight's very different as well. They have very buoyant tern-like flight. And so it's easy to mistake them for a tern at a distance. You think, oh, is that a common tern? But it's not got a forked tail. It's got a square tail. And so that's one way you can tell it from odd plumage, juvenile or winter common or Arctic terns that don't show a jet black cap, is that you will see that square-ended tail, that short black beak, and that contrasting black and white in the juvenile birds. And in the adults, the yellow beak, the dark legs, and the silvery grey back. So that's a quick run through of the commoner, smaller gulls. And once you familiarize yourself with the difference, even common and kittiwake are relatively easy to tell apart. Now, we move on to the bigger gulls. And the bigger gulls are harder work, but they tend to sit around for longer, so give you an opportunity to have a really good look at them. Now, herring gull, another misleading name, because I have never in my life seen a herring gull eat a herring. They're much more likely to steal your chips, your ice cream cone. My first memory of a herring gull was down at Foy in Cornwall as a young child, where my dad had bought me an ice cream and passed me the ice cream. A herring gull, as he was passing the ice cream over, a herring gull grabbed the ice cream, took it away, ate it, and then returned and pooed on my dad's head. He was most unamused, as was I, who was in tears because I'd lost my ice cream to a seagull. It's amazing it's not done me any serious psychological damage, and I still like talking about gulls. But in terms of summer plumage herring gull, that's the one on the left. Quite distinctive, pale grey black, black wingtips and tail tips, and you've got the little white mirrors in the tail. You'll see some more pictures in a moment. a yellow beak, a very, very bright yellow beak with a red little tip to the lower mandible, that's the lower part of the beak, and fleshy pink legs. So the legs tend to be pink coloured, the beak tends to be yellow, so they are pretty distinctive. Now, I would say that the leg colour on a herring gull is not always the same. So you get herring gulls that look a bit yellow, herring gulls that look very bright pink, but this one's the most distinctive. This is the typical plumage of a herring gull. In the picture on the right, you've got herring gull alongside a lesser blackback gull. This is really to show the difference in comparison of size, but also the black back colour, because herring gull in bad light can look remarkably dark. But there you go, you've got lesser blackback gull and herring gulls alongside each other as comparison. Here's a herring gull closer up with a thick yellow beak, and you'll see the blood red tip to the lower mandible. If you peer closely at the image, you'll also see that the eye is clear. So many of the larger gulls have a dark pupil, but then a yellow or orange iris, whereas with the smaller gulls, they tend to be darker eyed. Herring gull are very common. They are quite disruptive. So like many of the larger gulls, they are looking for chicks. They will often steal tern chicks. But herring gulls are lazy birds. They're opportunists. So rather than going for live prey, they'll often happily go for stealing your chips or your sandwich or raiding the rubbish bins at your local rubbish dump. And indeed, they've become a commoner species inland than on the coast in recent years because of the way we dispose of rubbish. And moving then on to the lesser blackback gull. Lesser blackback and greater blackback gull share a number of features in common, and that is they are the largest gull species in Britain. Actually, this one you look at and go, why isn't that a greater blackback gull? Well, I'll explain in a minute when you see greater. Lesser has a very dark slaty grey back with very clear white mirrors in the wingtips, a big yellow beak, again with a little red tip like the herring gull, white head, white breast and neck, similarly coloured legs, so sort of light pink legs, and a darkish eye. But one of the features with lesser blackback, which is why I've got this picture here, is that they are distinctly very long-necked. So when you see a great blackback gull and a lesser blackback gull together, great blackback gull looks like a sort of beefy bouncer from a nightclub, a sort of short, squat-necked, very heavy, thick-set, and lesser blackback tends to be the daintier of the two. So as well as having a lighter back and a generally thinner body and a longer neck, and if anything, a longer, thinner beak, they are very much more the more graceful and more elegant of the two birds. Now here we've got a selection of lesser blackback images. We've got a summer plumage bird down in the bottom left-hand corner, seated, and you can see the lovely white mirrors to the black wingtips. Further up, you can see one in flight, and it just gives you an idea of the fact that sometimes on the ground they can appear very dark-backed, and then in flight they can appear paler. So light conditions can make a big difference. I'm not going to concentrate too much on the juveniles and the younger birds in the picture, but again, it just shows the variety of plumages and how confusing they are when you get into juvenile winter, first winter, second winter plumages and so on. So let's move on from lesser blackback to greater blackback. Now, for those of you who are keen observers, you'll notice that on greater blackback, you immediately see one big difference, and that is you're dealing with a bird with a very big, almost parrot-like beak. Great blackback gulls have much shorter, stubbier, and bigger beaks than lesser blackback, and the red tip is much more pronounced, big red blood tip on the lower mandible. But the other feature, if you remember back to the lesser blackback picture, is that lesser blackback have the thin neck, greater blackback has a less long but more robust neck and a much darker back in all plumages. The back colour is, as the name suggests, greater and black. And in fact, one of the very few gull species that's name is probably pretty accurate. They are a big bird and they are very aggressive. And great black-backed gulls are the nature reserve warden's nightmare. And a nightmare for a number of very good reasons. But the first is, if you've got great black-backed gull around, there is always the risk that they're going to raid the nests of rarer species. They have no compunction of nicking young birds from the nest of pretty much any species. So they're a ferocious scavenger. And the other thing you'll often see them do is if a herring gull has nicked your chips, the great black-backed gull will come in and nick the chips off the herring gull. They are the top of the food chain when it comes to the gull family. So this next picture shows great black-backed gull in action with a very, very dark black, even in bright light conditions. And just looking at the bottom picture, which is a typical adult, you'll see the very, very heavy beak with the yellow and the red tip. There's a lesser black-backed gull species further up the image. Actually, it's a very yellow, unusually yellow-legged one. But this is just to say, for those of you wondering, but there is a species called yellow-legged gull. This isn't it, but it's just showing the back color comparison between the two gull species. But you've got a greater black-back on the right at the back, and then at the front in the middle, and then you've got an adult in flight. Now, the adults in flight are very distinctive. Not only this very dark wing, but you'll see a white trailing edge that's far less apparent on lesser. And they are big, heavy birds. You'll see the belly hanging down underneath the birds. These are almost skewer-like in comparison to the lesser blackbacks, with darker underwings as well. So that's the adult big gulls. And I'm just doing a very, very quick introduction now to juvenile gulls. And I say I don't want to concentrate on these because it will confuse many of you if this is your first time looking at the gull species. But the big challenges with the gulls in Britain are those who have yet to become adults. And the difference then between the gull species takes a lot more skill. This is a juvenile great black-backed gull and is probably of the bigger gulls the easiest to identify, partly because of its size. But if you look at its beak, you can see that it mirrors the adult's beak. Big, thick, but in this case, rather than it being yellow with a red tip, it's dark, but almost parrot-like. So if you see a juvenile large gull with these very cold plumage tones, very, very white and silvery, and a big, fat black beak, it is a greater blackback. And when you compare it with herring and lesser blackback, which we're not going to do on this call now, you'll see the difference. But just to show that there's one juvenile gull that is moderately easy to identify, and you can impress your friends if you can start to identify some of the harder juvenile gulls. But great blackback, probably the easiest of the lot. So that's all we're going to do on juvenile gulls today, but I want to now move on to a few of the really interesting and specialist species. First of all, this is my absolute favorite, Mediterranean gull. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with med gull, as they're affectionately known, these used to be a real rarity in the UK. You'd be very fortunate as a bird watcher to encounter Mediterranean gull, and in the last few years they've become commoner and commoner. Nobody really knows quite why, but one of the reasons is their range has increased across Europe. The other is possibly climate related. Whilst the Mediterranean gull is probably not the most accurate name because they occur further north than the Mediterranean in many cases, they are a species that does adapt to warmer, milder winters and warmer summers. Now, you'll be forgiven for thinking, but this looks like a black-headed gull. That's its closest relative in the UK, but there are some very distinct differences. So this is a breeding plumage bird, and you'll see that instead of the white crescent being behind the eye, the white is above and below. In a black-headed gull, the white crescent appears behind the eye and wraps around the top and bottom. In Mediterranean gull, it's above and below, but not behind. The beak's very distinctive as well. Instead of a summer plumage one being dark red with no other obvious markings and thin, Mediterranean gull has an almost carrot-like beak. It's thick and orange with a dark band and often showing, as this bird is, a yellow tip. It's also shorter necked and looks bigger. It is a bigger bird with a heavier breast. And you'll notice with the wings are significantly paler than black-headed gull. So very silvery white appearance. And then you look right to the other end of the bird at its tail, and what's missing? It's got no black wingtips as well as a white tail. So it misses, it's got missing the black wingtips of the black-headed gull. And so here are some images of Mediterranean gull in a variety of plumages, and I want to concentrate on a couple of plumages. So down towards the bottom of the picture, with a jet black head and the little white marks, you can see the summer plumage bird that we encountered in the previous picture. Directly in front of it, we've got a typical winter plumage bird. Now in the winter, they go with the little black smudge like a black-headed gull. You can just see behind the eye, but not as obvious, but a much thicker beak. And most obvious of all, it maintains the white wingtips. So if you're looking at black-headed gull and you're looking at Mediterranean gull in more or less any plumage at all, Mediterranean gull have much, much more white in the wing. But look at the bird just to the left. And this bird shows a little bit more variability in the wingtips, where there's little bits of black in an otherwise white wingtip. Some Mediterranean gulls, particularly if they're not quite adult, will show little bits of black in the wing, but never anywhere to the same extent as a black-headed gull. So if you encounter a gull that has little bits of black in the wing, but appears a bit bigger than the black-headed gulls which are surrounding it, it's probably almost certainly still a Mediterranean gull. As with the other images, by all means have a look at the juvenile and younger birds that you can see in the picture, but that makes life lots more confusing and is definitely for another talk, another day. And now we move on to what is also a real favourite of bird watchers in Britain, and that is little gull. And like the black-backed gulls, its name fits its size. It is the smallest frequently occurring gull in Britain. Now, you could go a whole year as a birder and not encounter little gull. They are a rare bird, and they're not a common or regular breeder in Britain, but they're often seen on migration. Small numbers in spring, when you're likely to encounter them with this beautiful jet black head. No white, you'll see behind the eye, and unlike both Mediterranean and black-headed gull, the beak is short, thin, and dark. In black-headed gull, it's longer and redder. In Mediterranean gull, it's thicker and orange. In little gull, it's short and dark. But it contrasts with the leg, doesn't it? So if you look at the leg colour and the beak colour, they're different. The legs on a little gull in breeding plumage are orange, whereas the beak is dark. In summer, in a black-headed gull, the beak is dark red and the legs are dark red. Mediterranean gull, the beak's orange and the legs are red. In the little gull, the beak's dark and the legs are orange. So different plumage characteristics. Like the Mediterranean gull, you'll see the white wingtips, but look as well at the underwing colour. So the underwing colour of a little gull is very distinctive. It's always, in breeding plumage, very dark indeed, so that when they fly, they appear to have white upper parts and very, very dark underwings, which makes it distinctive. Here's a little gull in winter, and this is showing all the various features that you'd encounter with a winter plumage little gull at sea. Little gull are not easy to identify at sea, partly because they move through very quickly. They don't hang around. They're tiny in comparison to many of the gull species, and they share the similar flight to a kittiwake. They fly very like a tern, very buoyant, very, very light on the wings and bouncy flight. Some of the distinctives If you get a good view, they've got this lovely silvery grey wing, but with this lovely white trailing edge. Do you see the white edge to the back of the wing that starts at the wingtips, the white wingtips, and works all the way around towards the white tail? If you look at the further wing, you'll see that it's almost jet black underneath, but again with that white tip. So under the wing it's virtually black, atop of the wing it's silvery grey, and it's that dark underwing that makes it much more distinctive in flight than the kittiwake, where the wing will never be that dark. So little gull, small, dark underwing, small and dark beak, sometimes showing a little bit of a black cap, white tail, white wingtips. Once you get used to them, they're quite easy to identify, but beware because they fly and move quickly through. I didn't want to finish a talk on the commoner gulls without giving a little bit of credit to the fact that we've got some fantastic rarer species. And again, the rarer species, when they're in adult plumage, like these ones, are moderately straightforward to identify. Once you start getting into the juveniles, they become harder and harder and harder. These become the real expert birds. So people who've done years of watching gulls, even they can sometimes struggle with juvenile yellow-legged gulls and second winter ring-billed gulls. Now, here are two fairly distinctive ones in adult. The first one on the left is yellow-legged gull. This has become commoner across Britain in recent years, and it is a species that is found down in the Mediterranean. The other image was glaucous gull, a big white-winged gull that's great black back size. Here are another two distinctive ones. On the left, we've got ring-billed gull. Now, this was the bird I told you the story of at the beginning. So yellow beak with this very distinctive black ring around it. You can, I'm sure, sympathize with me as to why I thought it was a common gull. But some distinctive different features. Very clear yellow tip. The black goes all the way around in a perfect ring. And look at the eye. In a common gull, the eye is dark. In a ring-billed gull, the eye is often very clear with a very small pupil, giving it a very fierce and aggressive look. And then these bright yellow legs as well. That's an American gull, the ring-billed gull, and it's the commonest of the American vagrant gulls. On the other side, we've got Iceland gull. Now, Iceland and glaucous gull in the previous photo share the same features in that they are big gulls, but unlike herring and lesser and blackback, they show these wonderful white wingtips. They're a really beautiful gull in all plumages, and the common thread all the way through. Even if you look in the, you've got a summer plumage one on the left, a second winter bird in the middle, and a younger bird on the right. But the distinctive feature between all of them is these white wingtips and white tail, whereas on our herring gull, you're not going to see that white. You're going to see black with mirrors. So that takes us through to the end of the slides. A whistle-stop tour, hasn't it, been through in the 40 minutes of the gulls, the commoner gulls of Britain. I'm running exactly 1 minute ahead of schedule, which is great because it gives us 1 more minute for questions. I hope you found that helpful and useful. I will make sure that that slideshow is available, and this gives us a chance to move to the questions. Over to Barry. Barry, I know there's some questions in the chat as well, but if you want to start off with the questions that were asked in advance of the meeting, I'll see if I can get through those.
Okay, Andy, thanks very much for that. We'll wrap up at the end, but yeah, thanks very much, Andy. Let me go through. You're right, there were a good few questions before, and I can see some flowing through as you've gone through the talk. One or two tricky ones in here, so it'll be interesting to see how you respond to them. In no particular order. First question to you. So when you've got a mass of gulls, when you're looking across maybe on water otherwise, how on earth do you identify? I mean, when you've got such a mass of gulls, is there any tips you'd give those on the talk tonight on how to identify one? I mean, you've given general tips about the specific features, but when you've got such a mass of them as you often do, any tips?
Well, it reminds me of a very funny story from Pennington marshes, and I was taking a wildlife trust group out, and we encountered a huge flock of over 500 gulls, and it was a mixture of herring and lesser blackback and great blackback. And the lady said, oh, there's a really funny gull in the middle of that lot. She said, what's that one? And I put the telescope up and it was a rubber duck rather than a gull. The starting point is you never know what you're going to find in a flock of gulls. But the very large flocks are really, really difficult. The gulls tend to form two groups. You'll get large flocks of black-headed gull, intermixed with herring gull and common gull. The quickest way to identify them is if you're watching them in the summer, because then the black-headed will have their dark heads, the common gull will have the yellow beak and smaller sized white wing mirrors, and the herring gull will definitely be the biggest of the lot. With winter plumage gulls, it gets significantly harder, but again, they tend to form into two groups. Winter plumage gulls, the lesser blackback, the greater blackback, and the herring gull will all occur together. And the way of thinking about them in simplest terms, if you see mixed flocks of the larger gulls, you'll get herring gull have the silvery grey black backs. The lesser black-backed gulls are darker backed than the than the herring, and the greater, the darkest of the lot. Remember, the greater will always appear the largest, the real bully boy with a big beak. The lesser blackback will have the thinner beak, and the herring gull will be the lighter coloured bird. So there's no quick way to learning them. The best way of doing it is to get them alone, where you can have good looks at a herring gull, good looks at the lesser blackback, and good looks at the greater blackback. And as you familiarise yourself with the commoner species, once they form these big mixed flocks, particularly in winter, you'll start to be able to pick them out and see the difference. And when you suddenly see a lesser and a greater blackback together, you'll be able to go, oh, that one's got a longer neck and a paler back. Yeah, that's a lesser blackback gull. That one's got a really big beak and a really dark back. Yeah, that must be greater blackback gull. But like many things, it's like learning a language. It's trial and error. You go out there and test it out, try it out, and eventually you'll be able to identify them when they're in the big flocks. But there's no easy route to it, Barry. It's all about practice, trial and error.
Well, I think you've answered this next one, Andy, but just as a supplementary one to the question you've just answered, which is actually, again, when swimming, tips on identifying herring and common gulls when they're both swimming. As a kind of extension of what you've already answered, but anything to add?
Yeah, and the thing to remember with herring and common is that common gull is a smaller gull. They are a bit bullier than black-headed gull, but they're a lot smaller than herring gulls. So if you see a bird that you think, oh, that's about the size of a black-headed gull, but it's got a yellow beak, then it's probably going to be a common gull. Whereas if it's a much bigger bird with a light grey back, it's much more likely to be herring. There's a big size difference. And also it's about where you encounter them. As I said, you'll often encounter common gull in flocks on farmland. But if you go to a place like Pennington and Keyhaven, the one you're most likely to encounter on the water of the grey blackback gulls is the herring gull. Common gulls you like to see on the farms and on the fields. Herring gull on the open water. Where it gets more confusing is on the scrapes and the lakes. So at Blashford Lakes and on some of the inland waterways, you can encounter all the species in the same place, and then it becomes a real art form learning to identify between them.
Thanks, Andy. Right, I'm going to switch to kittiwakes. Question there about, and you covered them, the ones we see from Hampshire, are they passing through, or do any of them actually nest anywhere near our coastline along Hampshire?
So to the best of my knowledge, and there may be somebody on the call who correct me on that, I don't believe that there are any kittiwakes actually breeding in number on the Hampshire coast as we speak. So in a typical summer, we won't get them. So the nearest breeding colony, and again, it's only in small numbers, will be in Dorset. So the Dorset on the Isle of Portland will be our nearest breeding population. Possibly St Alban's Head, that's had some breeding there as well. But the numbers on the south coast are low. So a lot of the birds we'll see passing by the Hampshire coast in summer will be breeding birds that are probably feeding from the East Dorset population.
Switching to one about colour schemes, Andy, a question here about why do you think gulls are predominantly, and clearly not exclusively, but predominantly white and grey? Do you have a view on that?
That's a fantastic question, Barry. And I think the answer is, like a lot of things in nature, they reflect the environment in which they most regularly occur. So gulls by default, certainly historically, were much more coastal than inland than they are now. And so the colouring will match the colouring of the waves. If you get a pale backed gull with a white head and white underparts against a very grey sea in a storm, it virtually disappears. And so it's their way of dealing with predators. It's in much the same way as if you're in a rainforest. Reds, blues, greens and yellows may stand out on a pylon in the UK, but in a rainforest they don't. And in the same way, gulls that are grey and black won't stand out at sea. They will do on a rubbish dump, but their natural habitat is over open water.
Thanks, Andy. That one actually, and this is kind of touches on your childhood memory of having your ice cream snatched. I'm sure many of us have had similar experiences, ice cream, chips, or otherwise. But more seriously, views on how best to manage gull populations in seaside resorts, particularly given that interaction between birds and the public.
So make sure you have pistachio flavour ice creams, because in tests 9 out of 10 herring gulls prefer mint chopped chip. That's probably not the best answer, is it, Barry?
Not the most. Yeah, it's an interest. It wasn't quite what I was expecting to say, Andy, to be honest with you. But
no, I think the answer there is they're very difficult to manage, but in some areas it's about councils control the number of eggs that gulls lay, so that the population is managed reasonably. A lot of councils use netting, birds of prey, scaring devices at the beaches. But in terms of how can you protect yourself from having your food snatched by a herring gull, the answer is don't feed them in the first place, because the only reason a herring gull particularly eats our food from our hands or snatches it from our hands is because people go, isn't that cute, I'll feed them. And so they become familiar, a bit like monkeys in some of the temples in Nepal I visited. It's the familiarity with being fed that then makes them associate food with something, food from the hand as something that they are entitled to. So if people were to stop feeding gulls, the problem would slowly die out.
So human behaviour needs to change, I think, is that one. One more before we move into the questions that have come through tonight. And this is really, you could do, as you've said a couple of times this evening, a whole presentation on this next question. But so it's about identification of juveniles, as you've offered. We may well be getting you back to kind of cover that topic after the new year or into the new year. But any general tips? I mean, again, I know you've given those on a number of the species you've covered, but would you give any particular general tips on how to identify juveniles? A really big topic, as I said. So that's for another time. But any few tips?
So I guess the answer to that is you need to start with familiar species and then work your way out. So the reason I put great black-backed gull up in a juvenile plumage is it's the easiest of the common gulls in a juvenile plumage to identify. And we talked about the size of the beak, which is very similar to what it looked like as an adult. And we talked about the very cold plumage tones. So if you familiarize yourself with 1 or 2 species and then start to read up about herring, lesser blackback, and then eventually the rarer gulls, you'll find that you'll build your knowledge about the plumage, the different characteristics. But it does take time, and after many years of watching gulls, I would still say I'm nowhere near an expert, and they can still catch me out in strange plumages in poor light conditions. So they're one you have to be pretty careful with, Barry. But yeah, as you say, it may be something that people would like a talk on. Though whether people can cope with 45 minutes online with juvenile gulls, that remains to be seen.
Maybe for the hardcore, Andy, that one, but to be tested. So as I'll say at the end, where we continue to be open to ideas for future talks. Switching to the black-headed gull, question here is, I was told that black-headed gull is the only British gull with a white leading edge to the wing. Is that correct?
Certainly as an adult in summer plumage, to the best of my knowledge, I'm just trying to rack my brains. I don't think there are any others in summer plumage that have the white leading edge. In winter, there's more variability, but yeah, if you see a white leading edge in a small gull in breeding plumage, then yes, it's fairly safe to assume that will be a black-headed gull. Barry, you're on mute.
Thanks, Andy. A schoolboy error there on my part. Thank you for that. I know there has been quite a bit of talk about the impact the med gulls have particularly on terns, because I know they can be very ferocious predators. Any comments there to share on the impact the med gulls are having?
This is specifically say med gulls are having.
Yeah, specifically med gulls.
On the tern population.
Yeah.
So the answer is it's really difficult. Here you've got a species that's been really rare and is suddenly getting commoner. And particularly in terms of the Farlington Marshes, Langston Harbour area, we've suddenly got med gulls breeding in areas that they've never bred before, and certainly impacting tern populations. Is there a solution? I don't think anyone's really come up with one yet. You can certainly be aggressive with gull populations, commoner gull populations, and do egg removal or egg translocation, where you can move eggs to another location. But there are real ethical questions, aren't there, about doing that? And I think with Mediterranean gull, it's not common enough yet nationwide where that may be a sensible course of action. I think in some cases where you've got black-headed gulls, for example, breeding in a place which might be depressing common tern populations or potentially little tern populations, there might be a viable argument for controlling the number of eggs laid and moving the eggs elsewhere. But I don't like the idea of destroying eggs or nests to benefit one bird over another, but it's certainly a question that leads to lots and lots of debate in a pub on a Friday night.
Well, we'll leave that one for such a night. Hopefully we can return to such nights in the near term. Let's not dwell on that matter at large at the moment. I always like to pull out a question we get from one of our younger members. There's one from Zach, who just referenced age 10. I know you touched on some of the more specialist species we see, but just quickly a recap on identifying Iceland gulls and glaucous gulls. Andy, just a few comments there for Zach.
Yeah, so hi Zach. So the simplest way to tell the two apart is they're both really, really large, pale, icy coloured gulls, very silvery backs and with distinctive white tails. And then they've also got the yellow beaks. But Zach, the most obvious feature is that Iceland gull is a daintier and smaller bird. So it still has the white tail, but glaucous gull is almost great black back size. It's a big, bully bird. And so if you see the two alongside each other, Iceland gull will be much smaller and quite white, and glaucous gull will be much bigger and bolder and white. The trouble, of course, like lots of birds, if you haven't got them alongside each other, it's not always that easy. But if the beak is big and heavy, it's going to be more likely to be glaucous, with a very big head, very big body and short legs. And with Iceland gull, daintier looking, more attractive bird, and smaller size. So that's the easiest way of describing the difference between the two. But Zach, that's a really good question. Thank you.
Andy, well done. Thanks for that. Probably not so much a question, but just a comment relating to Kittiwake about features. Mention here about them having jet black wingtips, but also jet black feet as other features of the Kittiwake.
Yeah, feet and legs. Yeah, so very, very dark legged. Whereas with the common gull, you've got the yellow legs, so distinctive difference. Yeah, so that's a distinctive feature.
Andy, we're just about coming up to time. Another couple of minutes. I'll just leave it open in case there's any final questions. Otherwise, I think we've made sure we've covered everyone's, both those positioned before and during this evening. I'll just keep it open just in case there's any final question. But on behalf of everyone, Andy, I'd really like to thank you for tonight's talk. A really informative overview about, as you say, the more common gulls, and you've teased us up for a taster of what more to come in the new year. I can imagine there will be quite a take, just based on some of the comments earlier. As soon as you opened that up, there was a number of people saying yes, please. So I think there may well be a demand for that more part two part of the talk to go into those.
No, that's fine. And as I said, just to say, you know, I'm more than happy to continue working with Keith and others on series on some of the specialist birds. I know there was a lot of enthusiasm about ducks, so I will be putting a duck talk together over Christmas and the New Year, and hopefully at some point early part of New Year we'll be able to do something around that. If there's appetite for particular other species groups that we might not have thought of, and you think, I'd really like to know more about X, then do put that in the comment, and Barry can bring that back to the group over the course of the next few days. Yeah, from me anyway, thank you so much for coming and being part of it, and what for a fantastic bunch of questions as well. Really appreciated it.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks again for that. And thanks for everyone who joined tonight. Just a quick tee up. We haven't posted it yet, but there will be a talk next week. The message will go out. The title will be Birds of the World's Most Remote Islands. So we're going to switch away from our shores for next week's talk. We'll formally post that and seek some responses to that. But Andy, one final time, thanks for a really interesting talk tonight. And thanks for everyone who's joined tonight. And I wish everyone a great evening. Stay safe and hopefully see you all real soon. Thanks, Andy. Night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.